The intergalactic tribunal floated in the void, a massive construct of polished obsidian and shimmering force fields. It was a testament to a civilization so ancient that entire species had risen and fallen under its watchful gaze. In its halls gathered the most powerful beings in the known universe, each representing empires that stretched across countless systems. Tonight, their attention was fixed on a single backwater planet, Earth. Ambassador Celine Carter stood in the center of the chamber, a lone human against a sea of inhuman figures. She adjusted her stance, keeping her posture rigid but not aggressive, her face composed. To show weakness here was to invite annihilation. Towering above her, seated on a throne of interwoven metallic strands, was Supreme Arbiter Zalare, a being of crystalline composition whose voice resonated in multiple frequencies at once. The matter before this tribunal concerns the species designated as Homo sapiens of Soul, 3. A motion has been raised questioning their place within the galactic order. The Zalari Dominion has called for their subjugation. The air vibrated with murmurs from the assembled representatives. Some species, particularly those aligned with the Zalari, watched with thinly veiled amusement. Others remained silent, observing, calculating. General Vieirac, the Zalari warlord, stepped forward. His reptilian form gleamed under the chamber's pale lights, battle scars crisscrossing his emerald hide. When he spoke, his voice dripped with disdain. Humanity is weak. Primitive. Barely a step above the lesser creatures of their world. Their technology is laughable, their biology fragile. They are an insult to the stars. Celine did not flinch. She had spent years in these halls, learning the patterns of galactic politics, the posturing, the undercurrents of power that determined the fate of entire civilizations. Vieirac was expecting defiance, anger. She gave him none. And yet, she said smoothly, despite our apparent frailty, you seem to be expending considerable effort to see us shackled. A few murmurs of amusement rippled through the crowd. Vieirac's eyes narrowed. We do not make war on lesser species, he sneered. We do, however, recognize the need to contain them before they become a nuisance. The tribunal is well aware of what happens when unchecked civilizations grow beyond their place. Celine knew the reference. The last species to defy the Zalari had been reduced to ash, their homeworld now a barren husk orbiting a dying sun. It was a reminder to all who might dare challenge the order of things. She folded her hands behind her back, tilting her head slightly as if considering his words. And what would you propose? A holographic display materialized above the chamber, showing the details of a trial. Humanity would face an orchestrated war simulation, pitted against the finest forces of the Zalari and their allies. If they prevailed, they would earn their place among the galactic elite. If they lost, they would become a client species, their autonomy stripped, their military dismantled. Celine glanced at the projection, then back at Vieirac. How generous of you to allow us a fighting chance. The warlord grinned, rows of serrated teeth gleaming. We must at least pretend to be civilized. Zalare's crystalline form pulsed. Earth is granted one galactic cycle to prepare. The terms are set. This tribunal is adjourned. The gathered delegates dissipated, their voices a mix of laughter, murmurs, and hushed speculation. Celine remained still for a moment, feeling the weight of the chamber press against her. Then, without another word, she turned and walked out. The moment she left the grand hall, a security escort fell into step beside her, leading her through the labyrinthine corridors of the station. At the end of the passage, a human figure leaned against the bulkhead, arms crossed. Commander Elias Voss pushed off the wall as she approached. So, how badly did they insult us this time? Celine exhaled. On a scale of casual mockery to existential threat. Somewhere around imminent enslavement. Voss smirked. Charming. I assume they think we don't stand a chance. They don't just think it, she said. They're certain. Voss let the silence stretch before nodding. Good. That makes it easier. She gave him a sharp look. You're enjoying this. Not enjoying. Just appreciating the opportunity. They stepped into a waiting shuttle, the doors sealing behind them with a hiss. As the vessel disengaged from the station, Celine watched the stars stretch and blur. They're going to rig this. Of course they are, Voss said. But that doesn't matter. Doesn't it? He leaned forward slightly. Celine, you know as well as I do, humanity has never played to win their games. We play to change the rules. She studied him for a moment. Voss had always been an enigma. A former Black Ops strategist, a man whose record was more classified than most government projects. He had been pulled out of whatever shadowy depths he'd been operating in for this, and she still wasn't entirely sure how much he knew or how far ahead he was thinking. She sighed, rubbing her temples. One galactic cycle. 6 months to prepare for a war we're supposed to lose. Voss leaned back, stretching his legs. More than enough time. The shuttle descended into Earth's orbit, the curvature of the planet glowing beneath them. Below, preparations were already underway, fleets mobilizing, engineers working around the clock, intelligence analysts sifting through intercepted alien transmissions. Celine glanced at Voss. You already have a plan, don't you? He met her gaze, expression unreadable. Celine, I've had a plan since the day they made first contact. She exhaled slowly, watching the planet grow closer. The aliens had called for war. They had no idea what they had just awakened. The war games commenced on the desolate world of Xiphos 9, a barren wasteland chosen for its neutrality. The sky churned with storm clouds, streaked by flashes of ionized energy. Towering mesas and jagged rock formations created a treacherous battlefield, littered with relics of past conflicts, shattered hulls of warships, rusting artillery, the skeletal remains of those who had fought here long ago. Above the planet, an immense armada loomed in orbit. Thousands of warships from across the Galactic Council gathered as spectators, broadcasting the event to their home systems. Some had come for amusement, eager to watch the humans flounder. Others watched with wary curiosity, unsure of what to expect. On the ground, Commander Elias Voss stood at the edge of a cliffside overlooking the battlefield. A gust of wind swept his coat back, revealing the matte black combat armor beneath. He surveyed the terrain with a calculated gaze, hands resting loosely behind his back. Behind him, Celine Carter and a contingent of Earth's finest military tacticians and officers stood at attention, their expressions unreadable. Celine crossed her arms, watching the activity below. They're expecting us to play by their rules, she murmured. Of course they are, Voss replied. That's why we won't. The Zolari forces had already deployed. Legions of reptilian warriors marched in perfect formation, their armor glinting under the dim light. Their war machines, a fusion of organic and mechanical design, moved with terrifying precision. Hovering gunships bristling with energy weapons patrolled above, while artillery emplacements embedded in the rocky terrain locked onto their pre-designated kill zones. On the other side of the battlefield, humanity's forces appeared unimpressive by comparison. A modest contingent of troops clad in adaptive combat armor, their numbers dwarfed by the enemy. The few vehicles they had were compact, unassuming, their true capabilities hidden beneath a facade of simplicity. In the tribunal's observation chamber aboard the High Council's flagship, Supreme Arbiter Zolare watched the proceedings with detached interest. Around him, the assembled dignitaries engaged in hushed conversations. General Vieirac exhaled in amusement, reclining in his seat. Your humans appear unimpressive. Celine's voice crackled through the chamber's communication relay. Final confirmation. We are go for engagement. Zolare's multifaceted gaze pulsed. Proceed. A klaxon blared across the battlefield. The simulation had begun. The Zolari wasted no time. Their front lines surged forward, thousands of troops advancing in a coordinated assault. Gunships swooped down, raining plasma fire. Artillery shells screamed through the air, detonating in massive shockwaves. It was an overwhelming display of force, designed to crush opposition within the first phase. Yet, something was off. The human lines did not break. The initial bombardment hit nothing but empty ground. The Zolari forces pushed forward, only to find no enemy at their expected positions. In the observation chamber, Vierock's confident expression flickered. Where are they? Then, the first counterstrike came. Not from the front, but from the flanks. Human soldiers emerged from the shadows of the canyon ridges, moving with eerie precision. They had not established a traditional defensive line. They had disappeared into the terrain, vanishing from sensors, using jamming fields to cloak their movements. Sniper fire erupted from hidden vantage points, taking out Zolari officers before they could issue commands. Explosions rocked supply lines as sabotage teams detonated pre-planted charges, throwing the enemy formation into disarray. Voss watched through his tactical display, his expression unreadable. They still think in straight lines, he mused. Celine arched an eyebrow. And we don't. We think in layers. On the battlefield, human forces did not engage in direct confrontation. They struck from the shadows, attacked weak points, and vanished before retaliation could come. Their weaponry was not about raw power but precision, adaptive rounds that altered their trajectory mid-flight, drones that infiltrated enemy networks and fed false data, electromagnetic pulses that disabled targeting systems at critical moments. Vierock's fist slammed against the armrest of his chair. What is this dishonor? Zolari's crystalline form pulsed. There is no rule against strategy. Vierock's glare darkened. They refuse to face us head-on. They refuse to be stupid, Zolari corrected. On the ground, the Zolari forces struggled to adapt. Their war doctrine was built on overwhelming might, on breaking their enemies through sheer force. But here, against an opponent who did not meet them in open battle, their strength became a liability. Their formations, built for direct engagements, became liabilities in this unpredictable, shifting war zone. Then, the second phase of the plan unfolded. From orbit, a sudden energy spike was detected. The Zolari fleet scrambled to respond, only to find their targeting systems disabled. Human stealth craft had infiltrated their perimeters, deploying electronic warfare suites that scrambled communications and sensor readings. Vierock's fleet commander barked orders, but the chaos only deepened. False readings showed human forces in locations they were not, leading to friendly fire incidents. Communications between ground and orbit were severed. And then, the final blow. From beneath the surface of the battlefield, seismic charges detonated. Hidden underground tunnels collapsed, swallowing entire enemy battalions into the depths. The Zolari lines shattered, their advance halted. Voss exhaled slowly as he watched the battlefield shift. Now they realize, he murmured. Celine glanced at him. Realize what? His lips curled into a faint smirk. That they didn't start a war. They started a hunt. Across the battlefield, the Zolari forces, once so assured of their superiority, began to falter. Their war machines struggled against an enemy that moved like a ghost. Their soldiers hesitated, second-guessing every step. Vierock's claws dug into the metal of his chair. His forces were stronger, larger, better equipped. And yet, they were losing. Not because the humans had superior firepower. But because they understood something far more valuable. War was not about strength. It was about control. And humanity had seized it the moment the first shot was fired. A sudden silence gripped the battlefield. The Zolari war machine, once an unstoppable tide, had fractured. Their forces were scattered, commanders overwhelmed, their precision formations reduced to isolated pockets of confusion. General Vierock watched from the observation deck aboard his flagship, claws gripping the armrests of his command throne. His slitted eyes flicked between the tactical displays, searching for a pattern, an explanation, anything to justify the disaster unfolding below. This was not how the war games were supposed to go. Humanity was supposed to break. They were supposed to be weak, outmatched, nothing more than a species with primitive instincts and delusions of grandeur. Yet here they stood, not just surviving, but dictating the flow of battle. A deep unease crept through him. He had fought countless wars, crushed entire civilizations beneath the Dominion's heel, but this was different. The humans had not fought back in the way he expected. They had not met force with force. Instead, they had turned the battlefield into a living nightmare, a shifting maze of ambushes, misinformation, and psychological warfare. He had underestimated them. Beside him, Supreme Arbiter Zolare remained eerily still, his crystalline form pulsing faintly. His faceted eyes reflected the unraveling battle below, absorbing every detail with quiet calculation. The humans, Zolare finally spoke, his voice a multitonal resonance, are not losing, General. Vierok's jaw tightened. This is not a true victory. They refuse to engage honorably. They skulk in shadows, attack from the dark. This is not war. This is cowardice. Zolare tilted his head, considering. Or perhaps you misunderstand the nature of war itself. Below, Commander Elias Voss stood atop a crumbling outcrop, watching the battlefield through the augmented display in his visor. The Zolari forces were faltering exactly as planned. Their rigid, doctrine-driven approach had made them predictable. They were creatures of habit, reliant on overwhelming force and numerical superiority. But strength meant nothing when the enemy dictated the terms of engagement. Phase 3, Voss said into his comms. A moment later, the sky darkened. Not with storm clouds, but with the descent of something unseen, until now. The Zolari forces barely had time to react before their targeting systems blacked out entirely. From above, streaks of silent fire rained down, precise and calculated. Explosions erupted across the battlefield, not random, but surgical, slicing through key command units, destroying critical supply nodes, turning the already chaotic battlefield into pure disarray. High above the battlefield, previously undetectable human warships shimmered into view, their adaptive stealth fields dropping at the perfect moment. These were not the crude, rudimentary vessels the Zolari believed humanity possessed. These were something else entirely. Sleek, agile, and unlike anything the Dominion had encountered. They had been in position the entire time, invisible, waiting. A feint. A long, methodical deception played out across the battlefield. The realization hit Vierok like a physical blow. The humans had never been on the defensive. They had never been desperate, never scrambling for survival. The entire battle had been an illusion, a carefully orchestrated performance designed to lead the Zolari into overconfidence. This was not improvisation. This had been the plan from the beginning. Vierok surged to his feet, fury flashing in his golden eyes. They played us, he snarled. From the very first engagement. Zolare's gaze never left the battlefield. Yes. On the ground, Zolari forces scrambled to regroup, their discipline crumbling as their support networks collapsed. Entire battalions fell into disarray as misinformation flooded their ranks. They saw enemies where there were none, turned their weapons on phantom threats, retreated into ambushes laid hours ago. Voss exhaled, his voice steady. They were never fighting us. They were fighting what they thought we were. Celine Carter, standing a few meters away, glanced at him. And what are we? Voss smirked, watching as the last of the Zolari formations broke apart. The monster under their bed. From orbit, Vierok's claws dug into his throne. Withdraw the remaining forces, he growled. Regroup the fleet. We are done here. Zolare turned to him, his crystalline face unreadable. You have already lost, General. Vierok snapped his head toward the Arbiter. This is a war game. A simulation. You cannot call this a true loss. Zolare's form pulsed. Then tell me, General, if this were a real war, would your people still exist? Vierak had no answer. The silence on the battlefield was brief, only long enough for the Zolari to realize they were not retreating. They were being herded. Voss watched from his command station, his gloved fingers steepled as the tactical map updated in real time. His forces had guided the Zolari into a kill zone, a labyrinth of destruction from which there was no escape. Every calculated feint, every misleading maneuver had been a thread in the web now tightening around their throats. Below, in the wreckage-strewn valley, Zolari squads scrambled to re-establish formation. Their training dictated strength in cohesion, but cohesion was impossible when every attempt at regrouping ended in another ambush. Plasma fire ripped through their ranks, unseen snipers picking off officers first, leaving lower ranks disoriented and panicked. A Zolari captain barked orders through the chaos, his voice hoarse with desperation. Regroup at the southern ridge. We need to. His words were cut short by the sharp crack of a railgun round, a single shot threading through his skull before he even realized he'd been targeted. Voss exhaled through his nose. And there goes their last field commander. Celine, standing beside him in the command center, crossed her arms. They're done, Elias. Call for surrender. He glanced at her, then back to the screen. His gut told him otherwise. Something still wasn't right. Vierak was not the type to accept defeat. A priority alert flashed across the display. Incoming ships. Large ones. Voss's jaw tightened. There it is. From orbit, the Dominion fleet made its move. No longer constrained by the illusion of a war game, Vierak had decided to show his true hand. Zolari dreadnoughts descended through the atmosphere like gods of war, their hulls burning against the sky. The remaining ground forces rallied at the sight, their fear turning into renewed determination. Celine's breath hitched. They're breaking the rules. This was supposed to be contained. They never intended to play by the rules, Voss muttered. Across the battlefield, the Dominion's final gambit unfolded. The Zolari, seeing their reinforcements, launched one last desperate charge. They stormed forward, fangs bared, their war cries echoing through the valley. They believed victory was still possible. Voss shook his head. Idiots. He switched to fleet-wide comms. Execute protocol scorched earth. Above them, humanity's warships, still cloaked in the void, finally revealed their full strength. The Zolari thought they were the only ones who had hidden forces waiting. They were wrong. Hundreds of human warships decloaked at once, emerging like wraiths from the darkness. The sky, once dominated by descending Zolari dreadnoughts, now belonged to humanity. And then, the bombardment began. Orbital railguns, unseen until now, lit up the heavens. Massive kinetic rounds, traveling at near-light speeds, tore through Zolari dreadnoughts like paper. Each impact didn't just destroy a ship, it turned it into a fiery, uncontrolled wreck plummeting toward the surface. The Dominion fleet never had a chance to retreat. The moment they committed to entering the atmosphere, they had signed their own death warrants. On the ground, the Zolari charge faltered. Their war cries turned into screams as their gods burned in the sky above them. And still, the humans advanced. Voss's voice was calm as he gave the final order. No survivors. The battlefield became a slaughterhouse. Celine turned away from the screen, unable to watch anymore. It's over. Voss nodded, but his expression remained unreadable. No. Now they understand. From orbit, Vierak's flagship was one of the few that remained. He stared in horror at the wreckage of his fleet, at the massacre below. His mind struggled to process what had happened. He had miscalculated. He had misjudged everything. A communication request flashed on his screen. From the humans. With a heavy breath, he accepted. Voss appeared on the holoscreen, arms crossed, expression unreadable. General. Vierok could barely find his voice. You would wipe us out. Voss tilted his head. You woke us up. And then, with quiet finality, he ended the transmission. Behind him, the last Zalari ships fell from the sky. The silence after a battle was always the loudest sound of all. Smoke still curled from the scorched earth where the Zalari once stood. The battlefield, once a chaotic maelstrom of fire and fury, was now eerily still. Shattered war machines lay half buried in the dirt, the remnants of an empire that had believed itself untouchable. The air smelled of burning metal, ozone, and something far worse, the bitter stench of failure, thick and undeniable. Above, the sky was clear once more. No more dreadnoughts. No more reinforcements. The Zalari fleet was gone, reduced to debris drifting in low orbit. Their last transmission had been a frantic request for surrender. Voss stood at the edge of the ruined valley, his expression unreadable as he watched the last of the Dominion's forces being rounded up. The few surviving Zalari warriors had long since dropped their weapons. There was no fight left in them. Celine approached, her steps measured. It's done. Voss nodded slowly. It is. She studied him for a moment. You don't look like a man who just won. Voss exhaled, glancing at the wreckage around them. Victory isn't always clean. Celine followed his gaze. The battlefield was a graveyard. There was no glory here, no grand celebration. Only the undeniable truth that humanity had not just won, they had dominated. A crackling sound came through the comms. The Zalari Supreme Council was demanding an audience. Voss accepted the transmission. Vierok's broken visage appeared on the holoscreen, his once proud armor dented, his golden eyes dim. Behind him, the few surviving members of the Dominion's leadership stood in shaken silence. Their arrogance, their belief in their own superiority, it was gone. Replaced by something new. Something humanity had never seen from them before. Fear. Voss's voice was cold. Do you understand now? Vierok's jaw clenched. The proud warrior inside him still wanted to resist, to hold on to some scrap of dignity. But dignity had no place here. Not after what had happened. You. Vierok's voice was hoarse. You could have wiped us out completely. Voss didn't answer. He didn't need to. The truth was already hanging in the air between them. The Zalari had wanted a war. But they hadn't understood the cost of waking humanity. Celine stepped forward, her tone precise. The Dominion will withdraw from all contested territories immediately. You will dismantle your war fleets. You will never threaten another species again. Vierok's mandibles twitched. And if we refuse? Voss leaned in slightly, his voice a quiet promise. Then we finish what we started. A long silence. The Zalari leader looked at his council. None of them spoke. None of them could speak. Finally, Vierok gave a slow, heavy nod. It will be done. The transmission cut out. Celine released a breath. They'll honor it. For now. Voss turned away from the screen, looking at the sky where humanity's warships still loomed. They don't have a choice. She studied him for a long moment. And what about us? Voss's lips curved slightly, a ghost of a smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. We go home. Above them, the fleet adjusted course, preparing for departure. The war, if it could even be called that, was over. But across the stars, the message had already spread. Humanity was awake. And the galaxy would never be the same.